Congresswoman, let me ask you about running for governor. You served in the House of Representatives from 2019 to 2025, which is this year. Uh, why did you decide now was the time to run for governor of Virginia?
I launched my campaign for governor back in November of 2023. And at the time in 2023, I knew that for me to decide to run for governor would be a decision not to run for reelection to Congress, which is why I announced when I did I wasn't running for Congress, but I'd be running for governor in 2025. And at the time, so many of the things that I was hearing about from constituents, so many of the priorities that I really wanted to work on are issues that you can impact really meaningfully and really quickly at the state level. And so I decided to run for governor at that point with the goal of working on some of the topics that I was increasingly hearing more about, issues of affordability, particularly as it relates to housing. The strength of our public schools, certainly in 2023, we were still in that heavy sort of recovery after COVID timeframe. And with three school-age daughters, I saw it day in and day out. And I love Virginia and really wanted to focus on growing our economy and strengthening our communities in a way that you can do at the state level, very unique from what happens at the federal level. And so I finished my term in January of 2025, and I've been running for governor full time since then.
How frustrating was it, or was it frustrating at all, being a member of Congress during the time you served?
So I entered Congress during the first Trump administration. I entered during the longest government shutdown in history. And I got there, and there was frustration after frustration, but also at the time, I think, opportunity after opportunity. And what I mean by that is certainly I was part of that wave class of 2018 elected to Congress, in part as a bit of a rebuke to some of what we were seeing out of the first Trump administration. And that was certainly the case for me and many of my colleagues who came in 2018. Many of us, if not most of us, had never run for political office before. And most of us were motivated to run for Congress, really to be a voice for our communities. We flipped many, many seats, took the majority, and then set about really trying to steady things. And so it was a really exciting time in a variety of ways. And then, ultimately my multiple terms in Congress, I really got focused on delivering for my constituents and working on projects that matter to people, working with one of my communities to make sure they could get the ladder truck that would allow them to respond to an emergency fire at a multi-story building. As the more rural communities developed and grown, they had an aged fire truck, and they knew that if ever there was some sort of, really strong catastrophic incident, they might not be able to save lives. Or working on water infrastructure, or passing bills to lower prescription drug pricing. I will say some kind of funny elements about Congress in terms of the function of it. Everybody's always late to everything. Committee hearings always happening concurrently, so you're constantly running back and forth. There's a kind of embedded chaos to the nature of the place, which I think adds a bit to the real chaos that increasingly I think has become so ingrained. I left in January was when I finished my term, and so I have not been there for this year's. I'll call it chaos, because from afar and from a distance, it certainly looks very, very chaotic.
Are you just as happy not to be there during what has been probably an extremely tumultuous time?
I am glad that I am doing one thing at a time in that, I really enjoyed, even on some of the worst days or the most chaotic days, I did enjoy being in Congress. I enjoyed the opportunity to be a voice for my constituents. Enjoyed the debate and the efforts to try and, find a way forward on issues. but I also was kind of intensely in it when I was on Capitol Hill or when I was spending time across my district. And I think that particularly given all of the challenges that have been created in Congress or that Congress has been responding to since January of this year, I think it would be very difficult to be able to. I don't know that I would be able to campaign for governor knowing that there's, issue after issue to attend to in the halls of Congress or across the district I represent. So I'm glad that I made the decision not to try to do both because what a time when, with this consequential gubernatorial election, I want to make sure that everybody and anybody I can meet across Virginia, I've had the chance to meet, which means I'm traveling constantly and campaigning constantly. And had I still been in Congress this past few months, I imagine that would not have been when given the sort of choice between the campaign side and the duty side, I would have been trying to contend with the issue and the chaos on Capitol Hill.
You have a very impressive CV. You're a graduate, as am I, of the University of Virginia. I'm afraid to ask you what year you graduated.
Just a couple after you.
A couple. And then you went to Purdue for graduate school, right? And then you worked at the U.S. Postal Inspection Service and later as a CIA case officer. Tell me how those experiences, all of them really shaped your desire to get into politics and specifically to run for governor.
Wow. Well, I think some of them I'll loop back, and I don't think it was immediately obvious. I always knew that I wanted to enter public service. I had grown up. My dad was a career federal agent, and I wanted to follow in his footsteps in service to country. He used to always say, "Oh, there's no higher calling than service to country." My graduate degree at Purdue was a dual degree program between Purdue and a German school, the German International School of Management and Administration. So I spent the majority of my academic time for my MBA on the campus in Germany. And so, improving my language skills, living overseas. And so while I began my career in law enforcement and I really loved it and found it challenging and interesting, and it's an extraordinary responsibility to be upholding the law. It's an extraordinary responsibility to be diving deep into casework, working with the U.S. attorneys, building out cases. I did a lot of joint casework, particularly related to drug trafficking cases. So working with local police and state police to build out these larger scale cases, doing some big search warrants and arrest warrants. It was a kind of a really, I think, particularly early in my professional career, a pretty tremendous um, way to feel kind of duty bound to other people because so frequently, as a law enforcement officer, you're contending with people in many cases on their very worst days. And if not, the very worst days for the person who's kind of on the wrong side of the law, certainly the very worst day for the rest of the family members or community members who might be there when, their loved one's getting arrested or their home is being searched because they have a loved one who's, been accused of and ultimately going to be prosecuted for a crime. So the sort of severity and seriousness of what my day to day was is something that I think I don't necessarily, I didn't realize at the time, I think how much it impacted me or, frankly impacted my sense of, my relationship to and my responsibility towards others. But I always knew that I wanted to spend more time overseas and live overseas. And so ultimately I left law enforcement and went to CIA. I was a case officer at the CIA. So I was undercover my whole time there. I got my employment declassified after I left, so I can say that. But I went through, all of their rigorous training to be able to work as a case officer, essentially living and operating overseas and collecting intelligence and information to, keep the American people safe and allow policymakers to make the best decisions with well-sourced information, intelligence. It was an adventure. I worked counterterrorism cases throughout my whole time at the agency. And, spending time overseas, knowing that you're working to keep your fellow Americans safe, or you're working to ensure that the position of U.S. global leadership is one where, we're working to keep other countries safe, was something that I really, really valued. And I loved it. It was an adventure. And ultimately, the adventure was one that I loved. But then we started, my husband Adam and I were starting to think about long term. What did we want? And we had spent time overseas, and then we were living on the West Coast still with my job. And we were bidding on our next assignment. And with CIA, it's the world is your oyster. So we one time had a globe with my oldest daughter. She was 5 at the time. She's in kindergarten. We pulled out the globe, really just meant to be kind of a teachable moment, and said, where should we go next? And we had friends who were posted to Kenya at the time, and we used to Skype. I guess people would Zoom now. At the time, we Skyped. And sometimes, there would be like monkeys in their backyard. So we said, should we go to Kenya, or what about England? And showing on the globe all of these options. And our daughter said, well, we should go to Virginia, with the same level of like excitement and fervor as we were saying, Costa Rica or Kenya, France, Germany.
Why was that?
Well, she answered that question. She said, everyone we love lives in Virginia. Why wouldn't we go there?
From the mouths of babes, right?
Yeah. And she said that so kind of, nonchalantly, like, of course, why would we not go there? And then she ran off to play with her sisters, and my husband and I just kind of couldn't get it out of our heads. And we started thinking, okay, well, maybe at some point in time we'll do one more tour, and then maybe we'll go back to Virginia, or we'll do this or that. And then it was sort of ever present, and we decided we'll do it now. We'll see what happens. And frankly, at the time, what we said was we'll go back to Virginia for 5 years. We'll give our kids a lot of time with cousins, with grandparents, and then when we're ready for the adventure, we'll figure it out. I had known people who had left CIA for a number of years and come back. The type of training or background. I believed it would be a possibility. So that's what we said. Well, for 5 years, we'll do it. And within a year, we said, like, we're never going back. This is home. Who knew? I had always been committed to like wanting a nomadic lifestyle around the world, and I literally now live like 5 miles from where I grew up, and I love it totally. So
During your years in Congress, what did you learn about or from your constituents that has informed the way you have run this campaign?
I think about the stories, I would say, of resilience, of the extraordinary thing about being in elected office, or even campaigning for elected office, is people will share with you amazing stories of hardship, of success, of their dreams. And generally, even just the calls into your office, you only call your member of Congress on your best days or your worst days. There's not everything's fine. I just wanted to say, everything's okay by me. I hope Congress is okay by you, right? It is, the votes you're taking are consequential for these reasons, good or bad. And so I think when I think about what I've learned from my constituents, I mean, some of it is I've learned about other people's lives. You get invited to places, businesses, farms, communities, literally into people's homes, and to be able to just learn a little bit more about people and people who are my neighbors, my fellow Virginians. But I think I learned maybe to take a few more steps back, and to gain, to force myself to have perspective and to be grounded. And, frankly, there are some people who I met along the campaign trail and through my first term in Congress, and I can carry their stories with me routinely, because sometimes it's a question of, in the day-to-day of the campaign, should we go here? Should we go there? What's happening? This TV ad or that TV ad, right? I remember a woman named Jennifer who I met in my first campaign. And she had told me the story of when we had tornadoes that came through Virginia. And as you will remember, they're not particularly common, but occasionally There was a tornado that came through Virginia back in 2018, and Jennifer was at home in her mobile home with her two boys and her dog. And when the alerts went out, she put her kids in the bathtub with the dog and basically threw her body over them. And as the tornado came through, it just peeled off the roof of her home. And I remember her telling me this story. It was within a month and a half or 2 months of it happening. And she was telling me the story. And I was just thinking how quick and how thoughtful and her maternal instinct and and here she is just calmly telling me this story, and and ultimately the repairs that she was doing to her home. And then I would see her periodically when I went to that town. And maybe about a year and a half later, I was at an event literally across the street from where her home was. And I saw her. I was leaving. I saw her in the parking lot. I didn't realize that she was just across the street. And she invited me into her house. That they had repaired the roof, and she had made some modifications. She'd repainted the cabinet in her kitchen. And I remember just being so inspired by this woman's strength. And so it's the stories of people that I meet. And I have like laundry lists of stories. A veteran who had been a firefighter in the military, and reached out to our office when he essentially knew that he was dying of service-connected cancer and related complications. And as his representative, my whole office worked to make sure that his children would get the benefits that they needed, and that his wife would be able to have all of the survivor benefits. But in addition to that, he wanted to make sure that other military firefighters didn't have the same struggles dealing with the VA that he had. And so, we looked at the history of times where he was refused access to healthcare or denied service-connected disability or service-connected illness. And we went through and built out kind of a comprehensive piece of legislation that would have been helpful to him had it existed when he first got sick. And to be able to tell his daughters and his widow that we were introducing this bill, and before we got his permission to name it after him, just to make sure that they would know that even when he knew that he didn't have much longer, that he was able to actually advocate for the folks who might be next. It was like, what an incredible amount of strength, and what a privilege to be able to get to know somebody like that. So, there's these incredible stories along the campaign trail, and I keep those stories with me. And so it's a bit of perspective, because no matter, the reason I am endeavoring to do this job is because there are folks like that out there that when I can help, I want to, and where I can draw upon the examples of strength and courage that they have demonstrated, I want to. And but there's so much that I have learned along the way, in addition to sort of like basic things related to agriculture and cover crops and all sorts of things I never had a reason to know, frankly, in my old career as a CIA officer.
Governors, as you know, Congresswomen, have really taken a huge role in fighting the Trump administration, whether it's over deploying federal troops in some cities across the country or the race to redistrict, if you will. I'm curious how you would characterize the first 9 months of the Trump administration.
Chaos, and that perhaps might be an oversimplification, but it's chaos. It's a constant pushing of the envelope. I think what we saw, and if you look at it sort of in retrospect, first it was sending troops into Los Angeles, and then it was kind of building and papering the case to try and expand the efforts to use the National Guard elsewhere. We saw initial efforts as it related to real aggressive immigration enforcement actions, and now we're seeing just broad sweeps where U.S. citizens are getting detained for days upon days. I think overall um, it's the tariff policies, right? The president put tariffs in place, then pulled them back, then put them in place, then put them in place, but not as high as they originally were going to be. But they'll go up later, right? It's this dizzying time, and I think that it is really destabilizing in a whole host of ways because it becomes so hard for people to remember where we are and frankly even what is normal. And I've seen that, and I think the least emotional for many people would be the tariffs, right? Where it was at first there was tremendous amount of concern. The stock market was reacting, and then it was a will they, won't they, and then it was a change after change. And now we are in a place where, I mean, there's a lot of Virginia farmers, and ag is our number one private industry, who have lost entire markets because of the retaliatory tariffs, or their input costs have gone up because of the cost to be able to input types of fertilizers or machinery. And that's just one industry. And if you go to the store to buy Halloween costumes, or certainly into the future for holiday presents, it's all sort of eking up. But for some people in manufacturing, people in agriculture, like they're seeing the impacts of it right now, and it's dizzying. And so I think that's the biggest worry I have, is that people are so fatigued by the moment in time that we are in the sort of dizzy and chaotic nature of the administration.
How worried are you about the strength of our democratic institutions? There's a lot of conversations about that. Some feel like those who are kind of flashing warning signs are suffering from, Trump derangement syndrome. But I'm curious, how concerned are you personally about what's happening in our country?
I am deeply, deeply concerned, but I am also I see clear paths for hope and improvement. And I think that we have seen so far that our institutions have held, but ultimately, in many cases, they have held because of the people, right? Ultimately, our institutions, even our Constitution is strong because people are willing to abide their oaths or uphold the Constitution. And we've seen real acts, I think, of dedicated heroism, whether it's U.S. attorneys resigning rather than doing something they know to be illegal, or whether it is, people making plain their objection to certain policies put out by this administration. But the thing that does worry me is that over time, because of that dizzying nature of this point that we are in, do people start to become disoriented and stop saying, no, this isn't normal, or this is a problem? And I think certainly we have seen, particularly in the private sector, private companies who have been willing to just accept this new landscape. And I think that is a troubling sign, wanting to appease the president more than stand up for what they previously have demonstrated were either their company's values or employees' values. And so the things I worry about is that as time goes on, and as people might just become so tired or so disoriented, or frankly start to forget what is what should be the normal state of affairs, that we can get further and further away from really a steady, strong democratic republic. But the reason even though I have significant worries and concerns, I think I have the opportunity to be able to see people who want to make a change at every campaign event. There are people who are excited to knock doors or make phone calls or engage their neighbors. There are also people who very, very willingly and freely express to me that, I'm a Democrat, but they're a Republican, and historically have been one. but they reject this version of republicanism that they're seeing out of the Trump administration, and frankly, efforts to appease that version of republicanism from our current governor. And so, people will frankly freely say, I may not agree with you on everything, but, I trust your principles, or, but, we need to stand up for what is right, or the Constitution, or I want a governor who's not going to just say yes, or accept every, terrible thing that might come out of the Trump administration that causes harm to our state and our economy. And so that's what gives me hope, is that, there are people who want to make a change and want to see a change. And as long as people continue to be motivated and engaged, then we'll continue to be able to push back. And that doesn't say there's, that's not to say that there are not significant harms being caused by the administration at this time. But I refuse to just accept that this is our new long-term normal, and that this is the world that, my kids and their peers are going to inherit. And so we've got to make it better. And I look forward to being some portion and some part of that as the governor in Virginia. And, as you noted earlier, governors have taken on a pretty significant and impactful role in pushing back against some of the, as I would call them, excesses of this administration.
In fact, I was going to ask you about Gavin Newsom and other efforts to redraw California's districts in response to what has happened in Texas. And I'm curious if that's something you'd be willing to do in Virginia. It's unconventional to do this in the middle of a decade before the census report comes out, but basically Governor Newsom said this is our only option. This is what we have to do. Would that be something you'd be willing to take on in the state of Virginia as well?
So I'll begin by saying I think that is in a different place given the state of our constitutional amendment than California, and I'll explain that in just a second. But the reason that anyone, and I remind any of my friends who take issue with what they're doing in California, the reason that we are even having this conversation is because Donald Trump said that he wanted to find 5 more congressional seats. 4 years ago, it was he needed to find X number of votes. And there was a principled Republican who at the time said, I'm not going to participate in this. You didn't win Georgia. We're not going to find you those votes. And right now we see President Trump say to a Republican governor, find me more seats. And Texas has essentially gerrymandered, because if they did not, they knew they would lose the majority in the House of Representatives in 2026. So rather than face voters at the polling places, rather than, stand up for the ideas that they, presumably have voted for and presumably would say that they support, they needed to fall in line with him and essentially steal 5 seats. And so it was in reaction to that California had said, okay, well, then we're going to make a change. And if they're going to, steal these 5 seats, we're going to have to zero it out. Now we see other states taking action, particularly on the Republican side. And so I think always I keep making the point, because the entire reason this started is because, unlike when it was Georgia and those votes, the governor of Texas decided that he was going to capitulate, upend the type of representation that his constituents, the people he served in Texas, has, to basically ensure that presumably Mike Johnson could continue as Speaker of the House. And so that gets to the Virginia piece, which is that Virginia has a constitutional amendment precluding us from doing any legislature-driven or any partisan-driven redistricting. We have to do it through a commission. And what is unique to Virginia, as opposed to some of the other states that also have a constitutional amendment like California, is that our constitutional amendment process is a 3-step process, a multi-year process, where the General Assembly would vote, then there must be elections, the General Assembly votes again, then it goes to the people on a referendum. And so, as an example, we're going through a constitutional amendment right now to codify the right to abortion access, to remove what we currently have in our state constitution, which is a ban on same-sex marriage, and also to put in our constitution a automatic restoration of rights. So we've got 3 constitutional amendments moving forward. Those began last January, and they will go to the people for a vote in November of 2026. So back to the question of redistricting, the earliest that if Virginia were to change, essentially pull back from our constitutional amendment to allow for any type of mid-decade redistricting, it wouldn't be in place before 2028. But the good news is Virginia has some competitive seats, and hopefully with our governor's race this year, we'll show clear numbers on a path to possible, likely, and I would say inevitable victory in at least 2 of our congressional districts to flip them from Republican held to Democratic held.
Let me ask you about the Trump administration's interference in higher education, which I have found particularly troubling, specifically at the University of Virginia. As you well know, in June, the university's president, Jim Ryan, was forced out by the Justice Department, ostensibly, and the Board of Visitors, in concert with the BOV, ostensibly over the university's DEI efforts. Now, UVA is one of 9 schools that the Trump administration has sent the so-called Compact for Academic Excellence in Higher Education, which basically makes requirements like adhering to definitions of gender and prohibiting anything that would, quote unquote, belittle conservative ideology in exchange for federal funding. MIT is the first school of these 9 schools that have refused to sign on to this. How do you think other universities should respond, including UVA? And what do you think about this whole compact for academic excellence?
It's an absolute outrage, and this is where I think I would push back against any of my former colleagues in Congress on the Republican side of the aisle, or friends and neighbors, or anyone who might defend it. Me of like big government, federal overreach, and frankly, all of the things that the Republican Party used to abhor. What this is the Trump administration to dictate how a university teaches, the research that they do, how they operate, and to hold federal dollars basically hostage in order to do it, to compel their submission, it is unthinkable. And so hats off to MIT for being the first university to say they will not participate. The University of Virginia, I expect, if it's going to live up to Mr. Jefferson's ideals, must also say no. And I give that example, Katie, because I know you know it well. For anyone who isn't familiar with the University of Virginia, like every minute that you are on grounds, they talk about the ideals of academic freedom and inquiry, and basically the reasons that Thomas Jefferson founded the university was for this pursuit of knowledge. And so it is absolutely, I think, it is wrong, and it is an outrage for any university anywhere to agree to join this compact, but it is actually sort of antithetical to the most basic elements of what the University of Virginia is as an institution, in particular, and notably also some of the elements and the requirements put in place by this compact violate Virginia state law. So apart from the fact that I think elements of it are unconstitutional on the grand scale, certainly as someone running for governor, I would make very clear that there's clear violations of Virginia state law in the type of federal government overreach. So my expectation is that the University of Virginia won't sign it, because certainly I think doing so would betray the basic principles of academic freedom and also the university as an institution itself.
Having said that, I know that one of the reasons that Jim Ryan resigned, as you know, is because he did not want the university to be prohibited from receiving federal funds. So if this is not signed, or the University of Virginia or any school doesn't join this consortium, if you will, how difficult will it be to operate without those federal funds?
Well, we are already seeing across, certainly at UVA, but at other institutions across Virginia, research institutions in particular, we have seen tens of millions of dollars already get pulled back, whether it's for teacher residency programs to train the next generation of teachers, whether it's research dollars at our R1 and R2 universities. We have already lost tens of millions of dollars across Virginia because the president just arbitrarily chose not to send dollars that Congress voted to allocate. And so we're already in a place of reacting to, what is essentially a bit of an emergency circumstance. And so this is where I would say, as it relates to this compact, there's strength in numbers. MIT, hats off to them. They were the first out of the gate to say no. And the other universities should follow suit, because if everyone says no, that makes the circumstance different. It is far easier for a lawless administration to punish one or two universities or favor a select few. It becomes harder when all of them are standing together and saying, we won't have you dictate the type of research. This is contrary to academic freedom. And frankly, this is unconstitutional. And so the more they make that argument together, I think the better it is. But there is still a rocky road ahead of all universities, public and private, that do depend on federal dollars.
If I'm not mistaken, the University of Texas initially seemed kind of open to the idea.
I will maintain my cautious, hopeful optimism that when faced with whatever the governor may want to appease Donald Trump, I'm going to maintain my cautious optimism until I have a reason to let go of it. That frankly, the researchers on campuses that have received this letter are going to, whether quietly or publicly, say, this hurts our ability to do research. I hope that there are professors saying, I'm going to go to a university where they're not going to dictate, to me, the words I can use in class, or they're not going to, further truncate the history that I can teach. And so, I question a place like UVA that is a top tier university that pulls students from across the country, recruits students, frankly, from across the world. The idea that the federal government would limit how many international students can come study, whether it's in Texas or UVA or MIT or the others, or that there would be a limitation put on the scope and type of teachings. Anyone who values not just academic freedom, but the vibrancy of a campus that's doing great work and solid research and recruiting, students from across the country or the world, needs to make plain that this will impact the future of the university. And Virginia is a fantastic place with incredible institutions of higher learning, publics and privates, large and small, land grant and not, rural and urban. But the University of Virginia is the flagship university, and the idea that with an estimated economic impact on our state of $4.5 billion a year, if they were to capitulate as an institution to the Trump administration, what's the caliber of professor that they'll continue to recruit? What's the caliber of student that they'll continue to recruit? And I think that long term, I'll just argue the brass tacks outside of the constitutional nature of it, outside of Virginia law, outside of academic freedom, it also just becomes a question of, are you choosing to make your university less competitive or less elite, or, less of what it was because you're afraid of a bully who's, illegally using federal dollars to make people, bend to his will. And the more people who say no, the better it is. And we saw that, frankly, with some of the law firms. Law firm after law firm were capitulating until some of them said absolutely. And we saw incredibly thoughtful, strong attorneys put out very public letters resigning. And there have been, those many of those law firms have lost some business. And the ones who stayed strong and said, we're going to fight this and attacks on our constitutional rights, many of them have gotten some new clients and some new attorneys. And so this is where we need to have people stand up for, basic rule of law and constitutional priorities, whether it's in the private sector, the public sector, the academic sphere. And that's, of course, not without its challenges. And, in the case of UVA, as a public university, the impact has multiple levels to it.
Let me turn to political violence because obviously that's top of mind right now for a lot of voters in the wake of not only the assassinations of Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark in Minnesota, or Republican activist Charlie Kirk. Um, eh, there's a problem here with Jay Jones. He's the Democratic candidate for Virginia Attorney General. He wrote some texts and they were released basically advocating for political violence against his opponent. And the Democrats in your state and other states, I understand, have renounced his rhetoric, but they have not called for him to drop out of the race. And I'm just curious, why is that?
I think there's a couple elements here, and I'll speak broadly, but also reflecting my own opinions. These texts are years old, which I mention not as a way to defend them, because to be very clear, I denounce these texts. They are outrageous, they're abhorrent, they're horrible. But to make clear the fact that they were held by members of the Republican Party, because these were texts between a Democratic lawmaker or former lawmaker and a Republican lawmaker. And so they have been held for years, and not released over the summer, where it would have been a valuable bit of information for voters to have, where certainly, if that would have been the path, we could have, there could have been a different name put on the ballot. It was, members of the Republican Party that held on to this information and waited to release it until after hundreds of thousands of Virginians had voted. And there is, there's no recourse for those folks. And so right now, at this moment, people have the full information before them. Unfortunately, because it was held, it is now in the middle of our early voting season. And people can make an individual decision. In Virginia, our statewide elections, we are each on the ballot individually. And so people can choose how they view these texts, and view, frankly, actions of the last 4 years of our current Attorney General who's running for reelection. And certainly, I make no bones about it, the decision is harder. These texts were abhorrent. But it is ultimately up to individual voters to make a decision at this moment, in terms of how they wish to proceed and prioritize in this election. If I'm being very honest, we are 3 weeks away from an election in Virginia. I have worked tirelessly for 2 years running for this office. I announced in November 2023. The fact that I say this with all due respect, because, I think it's a fair thing for you to ask about, the fact that I have to spend even a moment's time talking about somebody else's text messages from years ago, rather than what I want to do as governor, is something that I am deeply unhappy about. The fact that I can't spend every minute of the day talking about the plans that I have built out, not to be too hokey about it, but like my multiple pages of plans, my affordability plan, my education plan, my growing our economy plan, because of the, poor choices of another candidate, it is something that really clouds my view of all of it. And so, what we, the collective, we would have done, had this information come to light much earlier, I will say this. I would be much, much happier as a candidate if I could just talk about all of the things that I am for, and the fact that there are thousands of Virginians who've lost their jobs under the Trump
Well,
administration.
let's focus on those Virginia workers because that was a very adept transition into a really important topic, which is these Doge cuts and now more firings in the midst of this government shutdown. You know, growing up in Arlington, of course, so many people I knew work for the federal government. So, what are you going to do as governor to help so many people who have lost their jobs? And frankly, there will be more coming.
That's right. I mean, it's tens of thousands of Virginians who've lost their jobs already. Right now, within the shutdown, it's not just federal workers, it's government contractors. Um, I heard from a Virginian. He owns a larger size or mid-sized company. And he texted me over the weekend that if there was no real path towards the government reopening, that he expected that he would lay off more than 300 workers because he cannot keep his business afloat if they're not doing the work that they have previously contracted with the government. And it expands out because in a shutdown, or if you've lost your job through Doge, you're not going out to the locally owned family restaurant. You are, not replacing your microwave that might be on the fritz at the locally owned appliance store. And so the ramifications for the economy, particularly in Northern Virginia and also in coastal Virginia, Hampton Roads, is so significant. Though we've had job loss all across Virginia. And so as governor, there's a couple pieces. One, I cannot stop Donald Trump from the Doge efforts that he's already put in place. I cannot stop Donald Trump from these mass scale firings. But certainly as governor, I would be very, very clear in the number of people who have been fired, the attacks on what it means in Virginia. And I think that particularly the governor of Virginia should have a pretty unique voice in being able to ring the alarm bells of what, in the current moment, the shutdown and ultimately additional firings will mean for the rest of the country. Because, it's our national security infrastructure, people who are losing their jobs. I was at an event a number of months back, and I had a gentleman come up to me and say, I wanted to meet you and I wanted to tell you this. Tomorrow I know I am getting fired from my job under Doge. And he said, and this is what I did. He told me his agency, he told me the scope of his work, and he has a role within the national security space. And he said, I've loved my job. I love the mission of it. I do not want to lose my job. But importantly, who is doing the work that my teammates and others, like me are doing if they fire us all? And we've seen that as it relates to, prevention of outbreaks with firings at the CDC, and we've seen that with research into prevention and cancer research at NIH, right? It is not just about the person losing their job, it's about the loss of security in some cases, or research, or people who've been forced out of clinical trials because they stopped them. I mean, it's untenable, it's unbearable. But as governor of Virginia, certainly, I'm not saying that I would be able to stop it all, but to make plain what is happening is something that the Virginia governor should have a unique bully pulpit to be able to really raise alarm bells and ensure that the country, and particularly at least the Virginia delegation, Democrats and Republicans, are very clear-eyed in terms of what it is that is the impact of these firings, whether it was the original Doge or now what they're doing now. But I mean, the long-term impacts are going to continue to be severe, and Virginia's economy will bear particular, will receive particular damage because of it. But the ripple effect will continue across the rest of the country, for years into the future, quite frankly. But right now, we don't even have any good data because our governor has defended it, won't denounce it, there's no good data on how many Virginians have lost their job that isn't kind of compiled from different local organizations. It's just stunning how many universities haven't received their federal fundings. There's no compiled information. How many corporate leases have gone, out by the wayside because uh, full government contracting companies have just gone under and called their commercial landlord and said, my company has ceased to exist. We fired 200 plus people. We've ceased to exist. What do I do about my commercial lease? And that's a real example. That really happened in Virginia. And so to be able to make plain the impact is part and parcel of it. And then, helping, frankly, in some ways, like we do with military members departing the military and going into the private sector, helping people transition from public service into either the private sector or into state-based public service. So there's a lot of work ahead of us, but importantly, recognizing the outrage of this moment is essential as a first step.
Before we go, I wanted to give you an opportunity. I have a feeling you might feel the same way, that this is a distraction from your goals as governor. But, a big topic, both in the recent presidential race and now in the gubernatorial race in Virginia, has been transgender rights. And your opponent, Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earl Sears, has been advocating banning trans girls from sports. And I'm just curious why you think this has become such an animating issue in this race and in other races. And what are your thoughts on youth sports allowing trans athletes to participate?
Well, I think that we see, and I mean, it's about $30 million worth of attack ads against me related to trans youth, and that have run so far. And there's there's more ad buys in the future, some of them about this, most of them about this. And I think the reason that we have seen that Republicans continue to use the issue of trans kids or trans kids and sports participation as an attack, is there's multiple levels of it. One, I think that broadly speaking, every pundit after the 2024 election, at least in part, attribute the Democratic loss to that one particular ad that spoke about the sort of infamous they them ad, if you will. And so I think the takeaway from the 24 election for some folks was that was a really potent ad. And certainly my opponent is trying to, and even copied some of the language, notably the quote unquote is for they them element of that ad. And I think the real challenge is there's a lot of people who've never met a trans person, whether they're a trans youth or an adult, and so there's a real effort to engage in some level of fear mongering. And I really do believe that we should, as a society as a whole, demonstrate a fair amount of grace to people who are confused about, when we're talking about bathrooms or when we're talking about sports participation, like what are we talking about? And I recognize, and I'm a parent. I've got 3 daughters in Virginia public schools, and so I understand the fact that there may be confusion about what is my opponent, as a very clear example, kind of threatening, and importantly, the willingness to fearmonger with or against kids who are trying to figure out who they are, who are in a challenging point in their life. Middle school and high school isn't easy for most people, let alone if you might be struggling with or trying to come to terms with your identity. And so just as a basic issue of principle, I do find it really objectionable that that there would be kids who turn on the television and is in an effort to attack me, see images of themselves sort of reflected as a villain. And where it is that I actually stand on these issues, I really do believe that a lot of these choices, whether it's sports participation or bathroom usage, needs to be made at the very local level with parents and teachers and administrators, and not necessarily dictated, certainly not by the federal government or the state government. And I say that actually, in talking to my daughters, trying to gauge their opinions of things. And they somewhat, one of them somewhat comically said, like, nobody likes to use the bathroom at school anyway, it's so messy, and everybody's loud, etc. And so in some circumstances, there's single use bathroom in the counselor's office, and for it it's a situation where so much of it depends on the individual kid, on the age group that we're talking about. And that's the same for sports participation. And kind of fundamentally, just separate from my views on this as a parent and my desire to see real, like, local parental teacher educator engagement on making sure that all of our kids are comfortable and safe at school. I also, as a federal agent in the early portion of my career, I worked investigating crimes against children, and they had a federal nexus and cross state lines, et cetera. And for me, I am very well aware of some of the real threats that exist to kids, and the real horrors that have existed and may exist in the world. And I also have real significant worries about people making light of those sorts of horrible crimes, because they sort of want to bucket threats are all abounding. And for me, I think that what I have found is, I've had a lot of conversations with people along the campaign trail, and there's a lot of people who aren't really sure how they feel about the issue. But ultimately, what matters most to them is that they want all of our kids to be safe. And I've had conversations with people where they'll say, like, I don't really all understand all of it. But I don't have to. I want kids to be safe. I want them to learn, and then I want them to go get a job. And I think it's in those types of really just very human conversations where you'll find that community members are far more inclined to show grace to each other, when there might be real apprehensions or confusion about kind of harder personal topics, but then also grace to kids who are the ones, frankly, who are trying to figure out who they are, or in some cases trying to tell the adults in their life who they are. So it's an interesting time, and the television ads certainly are creative.
Well, it seems like it's really,
We're not talking about the cost of housing or rising energy prices, I'll say that.
yeah, and it seems like it really has played an outsized role in these campaigns, when it really affects very few people. And as you said, it's really not focusing on the issues that do affect so many Virginians and Americans, for that matter. Congresswoman, you've been so generous with your time. Thank you so much for talking with me, and look forward to talking to you again in the near future.
I look forward to it. Thank you so very much for having me. I appreciate the conversation.